Apologies for the sound of my voice. I've got a bit of a cold, but I'm going to do my best to make this video anyway. So if you've been watching my channel recently, you'll know I've been talking about Three Kingdoms, otherwise known as Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a Chinese classic, which I really didn't know much at all about when I picked this up from my school library, other than that it was a old Chinese classic. And I've been wanting to read this book for years, but also been somewhat intimidated by it. And I started with chapter one, and right off the bat, I'm getting hit with all these names and places. There's just a ton of names that get thrown at you in chapter one. And I thought, okay, I want to do this book, but I'm going to need some help keeping it straight. So I got this idea that I would look for a podcast, search Google Podcasts and see if there were any podcasts discussing this book. And if you do a search on Google Podcasts for Romance of the Three Kingdoms, there's a few different ones that pop up. One is just like a straight up audiobook of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms that somebody has released as a podcast. One is a retelling of Romance of the Three Kingdoms that somebody has adapted into podcast form. But the only discussion podcast I could find, the podcast where they actually discussed the book, was the Three Kingdoms Discourse. Actually, the name's a little bit different. On the Google Podcast, it's Three Kingdoms Discourse. On their YouTube page, it's Discourse of the Three Kingdoms. So either Three Kingdoms Discourse or Discourse of the Three Kingdoms, which is a podcast that's only just barely gotten off the ground. At the moment, we are only up to 4 regular episodes plus 3 bonus episodes, so a total of 7 episodes. Now, the intention of the guys who are doing this podcast is to go through chapter by chapter through, I don't know how many chapters are in this book. The volume I have here from the library is only volume 1 of 4. I think it's like 130 something, right? So presumably there are a lot more episodes to come, and this is a podcast that's just in its infancy. But I've listened to what is available, and I thought I'd give my thoughts on it just because that's what I do here. And just in case the guys who make this podcast come across this video, let me just say, sorry about this, guys. This is something I've started doing over the years. It started out on my blog, and now it's migrated over to my YouTube channel. Is everything I read, everything I watch, everything I listen to, I just give my thoughts on it. Just give my 2 cents. So I know that your podcast is still getting off the ground, but I'm just going to give my thoughts on what's currently there, and we'll call this like a mini review because the podcast actually isn't fully formed yet. And perhaps in 10 years, this podcast might be worth revisiting to see how it's developed. But at the moment, I'm just going to talk about what's there. And because I'm calling this a mini review, I suppose it's only fitting if I do my best to keep this somewhat brief. If you watch this channel, you'll know that brevity is not my strong point. I tend to ramble on about everything. But I'm going to do my best. Okay. So the very first trailer for the episode on the podcast feed, they announced their plans to release episodes every fortnight. And if you're not British, and I had to look this up myself, it means every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks the podcast comes out. Now, looking at the podcast feed, it quickly becomes apparent that they have not stuck to that schedule. I don't think they say directly, but I'm just assuming that this ended up being more work than they bargained for with the recording and editing, etc. So it looks like the last episode that came out is the Han Deep Dive, which came out on September 8, 2023, which was a couple months ago now. And I was a little bit worried that it may be a dead podcast. but I've started following them on Twitter. And on Twitter, that they announced that they're editing a double episode, which is going to be released in January. So they are still keeping this going. It's just going to be on a slow release schedule. Which, yeah, it is going to mean that I think this podcast, as it currently stands, is not terribly valuable for using to read with the book, which is what I was initially hoping for. But it only goes up through 4 chapters out of like 130 chapters. But what they've currently got is good. So, I would wish there were more, but the 4 regular episodes and the 3 bonus episodes that they've got are all good. Well edited, well put together, lots of interesting info, and served as a very useful companion to my reading through the early chapters of this book. I regret that there's not more, but I hope they stick with it, because, if they're playing the long game here, then in 10 years, this is going to be a very valuable resource for people who are new to the book like me. My only note, if you guys happen to be watching this, and if you guys are taking notes from random people on the internet, and yeah, I know everybody's got their opinion and everybody's got their 2 cents and stuff, but here's mine. I think it's possible on podcasts, right, to redo the early episodes and arrange those so they're at the beginning of the feed. I know on the YouTube channel, I think it's much harder to mess with the order of the videos. But I get this impression from other podcasts I listen to that they sometimes will add earlier episodes into their feed. If you guys could retrospectively add early episodes, I think it could be super valuable to add a couple introductory episodes before you even get into chapter 1. It would be useful for people like me who are coming into this book essentially knowing nothing. So I was thinking perhaps you could do 1 introductory episode on Chinese history up until this point. Just a brief survey, maybe as much as you can fit into 1 hour or something, surveying all the Chinese history that's gone on up until this point, because I'm noticing as I read this book that it's constantly referencing backwards to earlier eras of Chinese history, which I don't know anything about. The other thing is, I also noticed in a couple of your episodes, some of your guests talked about earlier texts of the novel or earlier variants of the novel. I think it would be interesting or useful to newcomers like me if there was another introductory episode just giving the history to this novel, right? How it evolved over time, what the textual variants of it are, what do we know about the author or the time that was written or something like that. So just 2 deep dive episodes at the beginning of the feed. One is giving the background in Chinese history up until the beginning of the novel, and the other is giving the background to the novel itself and the various texts that it's based on. Now, granted, this depends on who the target audience is. If you're playing towards people who are already big fans of the novel, then that's not so necessary. But if the target audience would be people like myself who are coming into this from nothing, I think that could be useful. Sorry, just a small note. Okay. Getting into it, back into it then. So they've got an episode 1 on chapter 1, episode 2 on chapter 2, and then after chapter 2, they do a deep dive episode on the Yellow Turbans. So the Yellow Turbans is a peasant revolt that occurs in the first couple chapters of this novel, and is largely not really explored in this novel. It's kind of like a backdrop against which other events are happening. But they did a whole 58-minute episode exploring the history and philosophy of the Yellow Turbans and what we know about them. Uh, and it was really interesting, and I'm so glad I listened to it because it helped to inform me a lot. And then after that, we have an interview episode. So this is another one of the bonus episodes with interview with an author, Baptiste Pinson Wu, who has published a book about the Three Kingdoms Yellow Sky Revolt. It looks like it's self-published as far as I can tell, so it hasn't come out from a major publisher. But um, I haven't read that book, so I was thinking, is this going to be interesting for me at all? And they were talking about a number of different things because they were talking about the whole period in general. That were completely over my head, like a lot of names I didn't recognize yet because I'm not far enough in the book yet. But the it was interesting. It was interesting just hearing his why he was interested in the Three Kingdoms. It was interesting hearing about his writing style. It was just an interesting conversation. I'm glad I listened to it. This is maybe as good as time as any to mention. One of the big things I took away from this podcast is everybody on that podcast is a fan of this novel because of the video games. And this is something that surprised me because those video games completely passed me by. And maybe this is an age thing. You can see there's a little bit of gray in the hair now. I was I think I was already an adult when a lot of these video games were released. Well, actually, I was actually looking at this online. And I think when the earliest ones got released, I think I was still in high school. But I suspect their big popularity may have been after my time, and Super Nintendo was the last video game system I played. After the mid '90s, I went on with my life and didn't continue with video games. Um, and in fact, I was completely unaware of what a fandom existed for this book because of the video games. As I mentioned in the video I made when I started this book, I think I alluded that I was aware that there were video games in Japan about this book, but I largely became aware of this book because of my time living in Japan and noticing that this book was very commonly adapted in manga and anime in Japan. And so just the popularity of this book in Japan is what made me want to get around to reading it someday. I had no idea that there was a lot of people in the West who knew about this book, and I had no idea that a lot of people knew about it through the video games. And throughout the podcast, there is constant reference made back to the video games. So that's been interesting for me to realize that culture exists and that all these people have come. It sounds like there are forums connected to these video games, online forums that a lot of these people have come through. So that's interesting. I should say though, for anybody who's not a big video game fan, the video games are referenced frequently, but they never talk at length about the video games. The podcast itself is all about the history. Okay, then we have episode 3 about chapter 3, episode 4 about chapter 4, and then another deep dive on the fall of the Han Dynasty, which again was really useful for me. I read this book, and it reads to me like a history. And I mean, I know there are speeches in here, and I know that there are the characters' thoughts are alluded to, but if you read the ancient histories, they read the same ways, right? Like Herodotus would also write in what the characters were thinking, and Herodotus would also write in speeches for the characters. So I had assumed that this was just like reading a history when I first started it. And just kind of assumed that everything in here was historical. And it was really interesting to hear these guys go through and talk about the sources for the novel and what was historical and what wasn't. Left to my own devices, there are some notes in the back of this novel, in my edition, which also help a little bit with that. But the one obvious example, something that gets mentioned several times in the podcast, is the eunuchs. So the eunuchs are portrayed as bad guys in this novel, or at the very least, their corruption is blamed for the fall of the Han Dynasty. Um, and if I had just been left with this novel, that's the impression I would have gotten away with. But gone away with. But thanks to this podcast, I've now got a clearer idea of the fact that though they're being portrayed that way in the novel, it may not actually be that way in real life. It looks like there were a lot of factions fighting for control, and the eunuchs just ended up getting scapegoated to a certain degree. Also, the yellow turbans, the fiction, the portrayal in the novel versus reality was quite interesting as well. And I mean, a lot of that stuff all the way through. And again, I'm coming into this historical period with nothing, blank, but I'm enjoying the journey of learning about it. The episodes are long. Most of them are about an hour. Some of them are over an hour. For example, the Han deep dive is, how long is the Han deep dive? Yeah, an hour and 7 minutes. The interview with the author is an hour and 21 minutes. But no complaints there. If it's useful information, why not make it long? They're all done in a conversation format. So this isn't like Mike Duncan, the other podcast I've been listening to, who just writes a script and then reads it. But the conversations are, what's the word I'm looking for? There's not a lot of dry moments. So, normally when you listen to a podcast, there are a lot of kind of or moments or pauses in the conversation. This conversation moves at a good clip, and pretty much all of it is on track. Like, it's all useful stuff. And it looks like, based on the comments that these guys are making on social media, that editing is a factor. They're one of the reasons the release date of these episodes is so late is because apparently they're spending a lot of time in the editing room. So apparently, or I'm guessing that's why they're cutting out all the fluff moments in the conversation, and it's all just kind of really interesting stuff. They have on different guests for each episode, so it's nice to hear a bunch of different voices. Again, everybody seems to have gotten into this novel because of the video games. All of their guests, at least all of their guests who talk about their history with this novel. Yeah, the first episode, they say on the podcast feed, we are aware of the sound varying. Sound is better on episode 3, Fire and Blood onwards. We aim to go back and fix said sound variation with our editor. So again, more reference to the amount of time editing for these episodes. And yeah, it is true, I think, that the episode 1 especially, the sound is not quite as loud. It's easily solved, at least for me, by just putting on headphones and just turning up the volume on the headphones. But yeah, it is, if you're, what I typically do when I listen to a podcast is I listen to it several times through. And so when I would finish the last episode, the Han deep dive, and then go back to the beginning again, I would definitely notice the drop in the sound. How long have I rambled on for? 20 minutes. So much for making this a short review, huh? Uh, the last thought I have on this is just the best way to use this podcast. So they mention in the early episodes that it's meant to be read along with the book. I don't think that's possible now when it's taking several months between episodes. But perhaps that may be possible at some point in the future once this podcast is all completed. And they seem to be intent on taking their time with it. And if that's what it takes to produce quality episodes, then by all means take your time with it. And hopefully it will be a good resource in the future. The other thing as well, though, the pages in this, the chapters, at least in my edition, tend to be somewhere between, 12 to 20 pages long, depending on the chapter. Now, I'm a bit of a slow reader on BookTube. I read about 20 pages an hour. I know plenty of people read faster. But that means if the episodes are about an hour, and it's taking me an hour to read the chapter, I'm almost reading through the chapters at a faster rate than I'm listening through the podcast. So now I guess you could just stop and take a break from the book while you listen to the podcast, and maybe that would be the ideal way to do it. Although, yeah. Once you factor in the bonus episodes, then it makes more listening. I don't know what the best way to do it is. What I ended up doing, initially I was thinking I would listen to each episode after I finish the chapter of the book. But because I tend to read this book a lot when I'm on the go, lunch breaks at work and whatnot like that, and because I tend to listen to the podcast maybe in the evening or in the morning, in kind of 10 or 15 minute chunks, I found like I was on chapter 3 of the book before I even finished episode 1 of the podcast. So what I eventually did is I just decided I was just going to listen to the podcast all the way through, and then listen all the way through a couple times and not bother aligning it exactly with how I was reading the book. But yeah, I don't know what the best way to do it would be. Maybe it would be best for people who are rereading the book, and they could reread a chapter, listen to the podcast, reread the chapter. Because one of the things about this book, I think that this book is kind of like a shark. You got to keep moving or you're going to die. What I mean is there are so many names and stuff to keep track of that if you don't just keep constantly plowing ahead and making progress as a new reader, I think there's a danger you're going to start forgetting who some of these names are. I mean, there's so many names that regardless, you're going to have trouble keeping track of them. But you don't want to take long breaks in between chapters, or you're going to... There's a danger that stuff is going to fade from your memory. So reading this book for the first time, I think you just want to keep plowing on through it. By the way, I am less than 100 pages away from the end of Volume 1. So I will, once I finish Volume 1, I'll come back with another video to summarize what my reading was in Volume 1 of this book. I am reading the same translation those guys are working from on the podcast, the Moss Roberts translation, so that's useful. I can recognize the quotes when they say them from my translation. Suppose there might be something to be said for using a different translation. It would give you a different perspective. But anyways, and I think that's all I have to say. So I will finish here. Thank you very much. Again, if the guys from that podcast happen to stumble upon this video, sorry. This is just a little project I have that every podcast I listen to, I give a little review of. So now that I'm done with this podcast, I'm going to go back to the podcast I had been listening to, Revolutions by Mike Duncan. I was right in my third listening of season 7, The Revolutions of 1848. And I'm going to jump back into Revolutions of 1848. And then once I finish that, whenever that happens to be, I'll review that as well. Thank you.